Have you ever wondered what a man is capable of when his destiny was sealed by a blood oath at the age of 9? This story isn't about dusty pages of history textbooks. This is a thriller written by reality, where genius borders on madness, and the price of ambition is measured in mountains of gold rings ripped from the hands of dead senators. In this video, you will witness the chronicle of one of the most brutal and incredible wars in human history. You will learn how one general forced proud Rome to offer human sacrifices and bury people alive right in the center of the city, just to ward off the threat. We will tell you how it is possible to lead elephants through a frozen hell by heating rocks with bonfires and dousing them with vinegar, and why the greatest victory on the battlefield turned into a personal tragedy for the victor. Watch until the end to learn the most terrifying irony of this story. How Rome, in trying to destroy a monster, turned into a dragon itself. And why the head of a beloved brother thrown at his feet became the turning point that broke the spirit of an invincible strategist. This is a story about how hatred burns empires to the ground, and how poison in a small ring can become the only exit for a man who held the entire world in fear. Ready to see the face of war without embellishment? Then let's begin. Imagine Carthage. The year is 237 BC. The stifling, sticky air of the temple of Baal Hamon is soaked in the smell of incense and fear. In the center of this gloom stands the great general Hamilcar Barca. He lost the war, but not the battle. He was humiliated, but not broken. Beside him, barely reaching his father's belt, stands a 9-year-old boy. His eyes are wide open, reflecting the flames of the sacrificial fire. The father leads him to the altar. Have you ever wondered what a child feels when his fate is decided for him? When childhood ends not with a first love, but with the touch of the warm, cooling flesh of a sacrificial animal. Hamilcar demands an oath. Not just a promise to study hard or serve the homeland. No, he demands hatred. Eternal, indelible, absolute hatred. I swear that I will never be a friend to the Roman people. These words, spoken in a childish voice, echo off the stone vaults. In that moment, the boy Hannibal died. The sword of Carthage was born. Many historians see this only as a beautiful legend, an attempt to justify the cruelty of the coming war. But look at the facts. This man's entire life became a direct consequence of that second at the altar. This wasn't politics. This was a vendetta. Personal, familial, irrational. Could you carry a childhood oath through 30 years of hardship, blood, and death? Could you keep your sanity, knowing that you are leading 40,000 men to certain death for a promise made at 9 years old? It seemed to Rome that it had won. The First Punic War was over. Carthage was paying monstrous reparations, stripped of its fleet, and locked in Africa. Roman senators, drunk on power, were counting their chickens before they hatched and tallying their gold. They made a fatal mistake common to all empires at the peak of their power. They underestimated the strength of humiliated dignity. While Rome grew fat, the Barcids took action. Hamilcar takes his son and goes where the Roman eagle does not look. To Iberia, to wild, untamed Spain. It was a brilliant move. If Rome controls the sea, Carthage will create an empire on land. 17 years. For 17 long years, the Barcid family built their personal state there. This was their staging ground, their forge for new recruits, their gold mine. The silver mines of Spain were worked to exhaustion, to pay for the future revenge. Hannibal did not grow up in palaces. He slept on the ground, wrapped in a cloak, ate the same soldier's gruel as the Celtic and Iberian mercenaries. He learned to kill before he learned to philosophize. He saw the death of his father, who drowned in a river saving his sons during a retreat. He saw the murder of his brother-in-law, Hasdrubal. By the age of 26, he was left alone at the head of an army that worshipped him not for his title, but because he was one of them. The year is 221 BC. Hannibal assumes command. Now he has an army, he has money, and he has a goal. But he needs a reason, a casus belli. Rome, in its infinite arrogance, formed an alliance with the city of Saguntum. Look at the map. Saguntum is located deep within Carthage's sphere of influence, south of the Ebro River. It was an open provocation. Rome was essentially saying, "We can do whatever we want in your backyard, and you're going to swallow it." Hannibal did not swallow it. The siege of Saguntum in the year 219 BC became the detonator that blew up the ancient world. It wasn't a quick victory. 8 months. 8 months of continuous assault. Hannibal was wounded in the thigh by a javelin, but continued to command while lying on a stretcher. Walls crumbled and were rebuilt from bodies and rubble. The inhabitants of Saguntum, realizing that no help would come from Rome, reached the brink of madness. They burned their possessions. They burned themselves. The city did not surrender. It died. When the Carthaginians entered, there was nothing and no one left to take. Only ash and silence. Where was Rome all this time? Rome was asleep. The Senate sent ambassadors, wrote angry notes, wagged their fingers. The bureaucratic machine of the Republic was stalling. They didn't believe that some barbarian would dare challenge their greatness. They thought fear of the legions would stop anyone. How wrong they were. The fall of Saguntum was a slap in the face heard in every corner of the Mediterranean. Now war was inevitable. But Rome still tried to play at diplomacy to save face. A Roman embassy arrives in Carthage. Leading it is Quintus Fabius Buteo, an old, seasoned politician. The scene in the Carthaginian Council of Elders is worthy of the pen of the best playwrights. Imagine the tense silence. Hundreds of eyes are fixed on the Roman. Fabius, standing in the center of the hall, with a theatrical gesture, gathers the folds of his toga at his chest. He looks at the Punics not as equals, but as a judge looks at criminals. "I carry here in my toga war and peace." His voice sounds dry and hard, like the crack of a whip. "Choose which you want." It was an ultimatum. Hand over Hannibal or die. The Roman expected fear. He was used to nations bowing down before the might of the Republic. But in response, he heard no pleas. The Suffet of Carthage, looking the ambassador straight in the eye, shot back, "Choose yourself." The hall buzzed with approval. The pride that had been trampled for 20 years finally raised its head. Fabius, his expression unchanged, opened his arms, letting the folds of his toga fall. "Then I give you war," he shouted. And hundreds of throats in a single impulse, as if exhaling the rage accumulated over decades, replied, "We accept it." This shout marked the end of the old world. Diplomacy was over. Parchments and treaties turned to dust. Now, steel would speak. The Romans left the hall, confident in their quick and easy victory. They planned to wage war in Spain and Africa, as they were accustomed. They thought they were dictating the rules of the game. None of them could imagine that at this very moment, thousands of kilometers away, in New Carthage, a young general had already spread a map on the table and was looking not south, but north. at the mountains considered impassable, at the Alps. Hannibal understood what Rome did not. It is impossible to beat the system by playing by its rules. Rome has more people, more ships, more resources. If a war of attrition begins, Carthage will lose. The only chance is to strike at the very heart, to do the impossible, to bring the terror of war to a place where it hasn't been expected for hundreds of years, right to the gates of Rome. A plan, insane in its audacity, had already matured in his mind. A plan that any reasonable strategist would call suicide. But Hannibal was not a reasonable strategist. He was a gambler, betting everything on zero. He gathered an army, a motley mix of Iberians, Numidians, Balearic slingers, and, of course, elephants, the living tanks of antiquity. He was not preparing them for a walk. He was preparing them for a journey beyond the limits of human capability. Who is the real monster here? The man willing to sacrifice half his army for a ghostly chance at revenge? Or the empire that, through its arrogance, raised its own executioner? The answer to this question would soon be written in blood on the snow of the Alpine passes. The die is cast. The mechanism is in motion. And while politicians in Rome made pompous speeches, clouds were gathering in the north, foreshadowing a storm the likes of which the world had never seen. Roman admirals stared at the horizon, expecting to see the sails of the Punic fleet. They were sure war would come from the water. This is logical, rational, predictable. But Hannibal was not looking for logic. He was looking for victory. While patrols combed the sea's surface, a 40,000-strong army, stretching like a living snake for kilometers, was already biting into the foothills of the Alps. The general chose an enemy with whom one cannot negotiate, whom one cannot bribe, and whom it is impossible to intimidate. He challenged nature itself. Late October. In the mountains, this is no longer autumn, it is the prelude to winter. Imagine standing at the foot of a stone wall reaching into the sky. The peaks are hidden in leaden clouds radiating a grave cold. Your sandals slip on wet leaves, and your tunic, accustomed to the hot sun of Africa and Spain, feels as thin as a spider web. Hannibal pointed to these peaks and said, "Our path lies there." The soldiers looked at him as if he were a madman. In their eyes, a silent question could be read. Are you leading us to fight Rome, or to die amidst the ice? The ascent began. It was a march into the underworld, only the path led not down, but up. With every kilometer, the air became thinner, breathing became harder. But the cold was not the only killer. Local mountain tribes, the Allobroges, watched the strangers from the height of their eagle nests. For them, this army was simply long, clumsy prey. Ambushes started suddenly. The silence of the mountains was torn by whistling, and a rain of stones and arrows crashed down on the column. Imagine the chaos on a narrow path where to the left is a sheer cliff, and to the right is a bottomless abyss. Horses neighed in terror, reared up, and, losing their balance, plummeted into the void, dragging wagons of provisions and screaming men with them. The sound of a body falling into an abyss isn't a loud thud. It is a long, fading scream that suddenly cuts off. And then, silence again. Hannibal darted along the column, organizing the defense, beating back the barbarian attacks. But he could not beat back the attack of gravity. And then the snow began. It covered the trails, hiding the crevices. One wrong step, and a foot plunged into emptiness. Men didn't die from swords. They froze in their sleep, sitting down to rest for a minute and remaining there forever, turning into ice statues. Their toes rotted, skin turned black and peeled off. But the most surreal sight was the elephants. 37 gray giants, born under the scorching sun of the savannah, trudging knee-deep in snow. Their breath escaped in clouds of steam, their hides covered in frost. They trumpeted from the cold, and this trumpet call, reflecting off the rocks, sounded like the weeping of ancient monsters. The animals slipped, fell, broke their legs, but continued to walk, driven by the will of one man. On the 9th day, they reached the pass, the top of the world. Hannibal, standing on a peak swept by all winds, tried to breathe life into his exhausted men. He pointed his hand down, to the south, where through breaks in the clouds the green valley of the Po River could be seen. "There is Italy!" he shouted, overpowering the howl of the wind. "There is Rome! You hold in your hands not only the walls of Italy, but the citadel of Rome itself." It was a white lie. Rome was still far away, and the descent proved more terrifying than the ascent. The path on the southern slope was steeper. It was covered with a crust of ice dusted with fresh snow. Men slid down like stones. But the worst awaited ahead. A landslide had completely destroyed the road. An abyss hundreds of meters wide opened up before the army. There was no way back. There was no way forward either. Anyone else in Hannibal's place would have surrendered, would have lain down on the snow and accepted death. But Barca ordered them to cut a path through the rock. Titus Livius describes a scene that seems like a myth, but confirms the engineering genius of the Carthaginians. They felled huge trees and built giant bonfires on the rocks. When the rock heated to a red glow, they doused it with vinegar from the soldiers' flasks. The stone hissed, cracked from the temperature shock, and crumbled. Choking in acrid smoke, starving, frost-bitten men gnawed a ledge out of the rock with pickaxes and crowbars. 4 days. 4 days of hell to get the elephants through. Who is the real titan here? The one who moves mountains with faith? Or the one who crumbles them with vinegar and rage? When they finally descended into the valley, it was no longer an army. They were shadows. Almost 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry had left Spain. 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry reached Italy. Half the army remained lying in the mountains, becoming food for wolves and eagles. Think about that number. Every second man didn't make it. Every step of this expedition was paid for with someone's life. The local Gauls, seeing these ghosts emerging from the mist, could not believe their eyes. Ragged, emaciated, looking like the living dead, they led frostbitten elephants behind them. Roman spies reported to the Senate, "Hannibal has lost his army. He is not dangerous." This was Rome's second fatal mistake. The mountains killed the weak. The mountains killed the random men. Those who survived had gone through natural selection of such cruelty that no Spartan school had ever known. The remaining 26,000 were not just soldiers. They were a pack of wolves who had survived the frozen desert, welded together by a single fate and absolute faith in their leader. They had eaten their fear back there on the pass. While Hannibal gave his men a short respite to eat and clean their rusted weapons, the Roman machine began to clumsily turn around. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the father of the future conqueror, hurriedly transferred legions from the south to the north. He rushed to the Ticinus River, confident that he would easily crush a bunch of ragamuffins who had fallen from the mountains. The Romans marched, their polished armor shining, well-fed, confident in their superiority, discussing how quickly they would finish this campaign and return home for the holidays. They didn't know that a force was moving toward them that could not be measured by the number of swords. In the frosty air over the plain, the smell of first blood already lingered, and on the banks of the Ticinus River, Numidian cavalrymen were already saddling their horses, checking the sharpness of their javelins. The first skirmish at the Ticinus River was not a battle in the full sense of the word. It was a reconnaissance in force that turned into a slap in the face. The Roman heavy cavalry, the pride of the Republic, shattered under the blows of the agile Numidians like glass under a hammer. Consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, the very one who had rushed from the south, nearly died. Picture this scene. The consul, surrounded by enemies, bleeding, is saved not by the Praetorian Guard, but by his 17-year-old son. A youth who charges into the enemy formation alone to drag his father out. Remember this boy. His name is also Publius Cornelius Scipio. Years later, the world will know him by the name Africanus, but that will be later. And now, in the cold November of the year 218 BC, the wounded consul commands a retreat. Rome was in shock. Retreat? Roman consuls do not retreat. In the Senate, it was not so much gloom as irritation that reigned. Scipio simply showed weakness, they whispered in the corridors. We need a real man. And Rome sent a real man. The second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus. He arrived from Sicily, burning with righteous anger and ambition. His term as consul was expiring in a couple of months. He needed a victory. Urgently, right now, he needed a triumph to secure his political future. Hannibal, whose spies sat in every tavern, knew this. He knew that Sempronius was not a general, but a politician with a sword. A gambler who is easily tricked into making a bet. December 218, the winter solstice. In the valley of the Trebia River, it is so cold that birds freeze in mid-flight. Hannibal sets the stage for his production. He orders his warriors to eat a hearty meal of hot meat and liberally rub their bodies with olive oil and fat by the fires. This isn't luxury. This is thermal insulation. His men sit in warmth, checking their weapons, and wait. And what about the Roman camp? Silence. Sempronius is sure the Carthaginians are afraid to come out into the open. Dawn. The leaden sky barely brightens. Suddenly, the Roman camp wakes up to wild screeching and the whistle of javelins. Numidian cavalry attacks the gates. It's bait. Sempronius, without even giving his soldiers time for breakfast, without letting them put on their under-armor padding, shouts, "Attack!" 40,000 men pour out into the freezing cold. Hungry, sleepy, half-dressed. They see the fleeing Numidians and rush in pursuit. Between the Romans and Hannibal's army flows the Trebia. In summer, it's a stream. Now, swollen with rain and melted snow, it is an icy torrent, chest deep on a grown man. The Romans enter the water. Have you ever tried stepping into an icy river in winter? Your breath catches, your heart skips a beat, your muscles cramp. Now imagine you have to hold a heavy shield and sword above your head so they aren't swept away by the current. The legions spent an hour crossing the river, an hour in icy water. When they climbed onto the opposite bank, they had already lost. They hadn't met the enemy yet, but they were already dead. Their tunics had turned into icy shells. Their hands were so numb they couldn't grip the handle of a gladius. They were shaking so hard that the chattering of their teeth drowned out the clatter of armor. And before them, lined up in perfect order, stood Hannibal's army. Well-fed, warm, full of strength. Sempronius Longus arranged the legions in the standard battle order. He still believed that Roman discipline was stronger than physics. "Forward!" he commanded, and the frozen, hungry crowd marched to die. The Velites, skirmishers, tried to throw their javelins, but their fingers wouldn't unbend. The infantry crashed into the Carthaginian line, but it was a slaughter of innocents. Hannibal threw elephants into the fray on the flanks, and the Roman cavalry scattered in terror. Horses cannot stand the smell of elephants. They go mad. But the main surprise was yet to come. Hannibal had hidden his younger brother, Mago, with 2,000 elite warriors in a ravine overgrown with bushes right behind the Roman line. When the legions got bogged down in the fight, Mago struck from the rear. The trap snapped shut. This wasn't a battle. It was a slaughterhouse. The Romans were squeezed in a vice. In front, a wall of shields. Behind, Mago's fresh forces. On the flanks, elephants and cavalry. Panic seized the legions. Men tried to run, but there was nowhere to run. Behind them was that same icy Trebia. Thousands were hacked down on the spot. Thousands threw themselves into the river and drowned, dragged to the bottom by the weight of their armor. The water in the Trebia turned red and thick like wine. Sempronius Longus, the very one who dreamed of triumph, broke through the encirclement with a pathetic handful of soldiers and fled to Placentia, leaving his army to die. That night, the wind over the battlefield howled especially eerily, mixing with the groans of the dying who were freezing among the corpses. Rome lost nearly 30,000 men, 30,000 sons, fathers, and husbands. Hannibal lost a minimum, mostly Celts whom he used as cannon fodder in the center of the formation. But this victory gave him something more than just the destruction of an enemy army. It broke a psychological barrier. Gallic tribes who until then had been sitting on the fence, waiting for a winner, now poured into his army en masse. Hannibal showed that the Roman lion could not only be wounded, it could be gutted. In Rome, panic began. For the first time in centuries, war had come to their doorstep, and it was terrifying. Official reports lied. Sempronius wrote to the Senate, "The battle would have been won if not for the bad weather." But the truth cannot be hidden when tens of thousands of soldiers do not return to the city. Mothers sobbed in the forum. Fathers cursed the stupidity of the generals. But Rome is a hydra. Cut off one head, two grow back. Instead of suing for peace, the Republic bared its fang. In the winter of the year 217 BC, new elections were held. Gaius Flaminius became consul, a man of the people, a populist, a hater of the aristocracy, even more hot-headed and impulsive than Sempronius. He promised the people a quick victory. He gathered a new army, even larger than the previous one. "I will not sit and wait," he shouted in the squares. "I will find this African and bring him back in chains." Flaminius was sure he would learn from his predecessor's mistakes. He wouldn't let himself be lured into a trap. He would become the hunter himself. He led his army into Etruria to block the road to Rome. He thought he knew where Hannibal would be, but Hannibal again did what no one expected. While Flaminius guarded the convenient roads, the Carthaginian army entered the swamps near the Arno River. For 4 days and 3 nights, they marched waist-deep in rotten water. There was nowhere to sleep. Soldiers lay on the corpses of fallen animals just to close their eyes for a minute above the water. Hannibal rode on the only surviving elephant. An infection got into his eye. In those fetid swamps, suffering from hellish pain, he lost sight in one eye. But when the one-eyed demon emerged from the quagmire in Flaminius's rear, the Roman consul realized he had been outplayed before the battle had even begun. Rage blinded Flaminius worse than any infection. He rushed in pursuit, sending out no scouts, listening to no officers. He saw only the smoke from burning villages that Hannibal left like a trail of breadcrumbs. A trail leading straight into a narrow defile at Lake Trasimene, where the morning mist already hid the shine of thousands of blades thirsting for new blood. Early morning, June 21st, 217 BC. Picture this landscape. Lake Trasimene, a calm sheet of water reflecting the hills, and fog.
Thick, milky, unnaturally dense fog rising from the water and filling the entire valley. Visibility is zero. You stretch out your hand and don't see your own fingers. In this white silence, only the rhythmic stomp of thousands of sandals and the clatter of iron can be heard. This is the army of Consul Gaius Flaminius entering the narrow defile between the mountains and the lakeshore. Flaminius is in a hurry. He is furious. For the last few days, he has seen only the backs of Numidian riders and the smoke of burned Etruscan villages. Hannibal teased him, loomed before his nose like a matador before a bull, and led him further into the trap. The consul is certain. The Carthaginians are fleeing. They are afraid to fight. He just needs to catch up, strike the rear, and crush them. He didn't even send out scouts. Why? After all, he is the hunter, not the prey. The Roman column stretched for kilometers, trapped in a narrow stone sack. To the right, steep, forest-covered hills. To the left, the swampy shore of the lake. Ahead and behind, fog. They entered this white haze as if into a crypt. None of the 30,000 Romans knew that the hills to the right were not empty. There in the silence, holding their breath, lay Libyans, Iberians, and Celts. Hannibal had positioned his army literally above the heads of the Romans. He saw everything. The Romans saw nothing. It was a flawless, textbook ambush that is still studied in military academies today. Hannibal waited until the entire column was drawn into the pass, until the last Roman soldier was in the bag. And when the Roman vanguard ran into a blockade of heavy infantry, somewhere high on the hill, a lonely, sharp trumpet signal sounded, and the fog screamed. Imagine the horror of a man who hears the roar of thousands of throats, but sees no enemy. From the hills, straight out of the white veil, death crashed down on the Romans. This wasn't a battle of two lines. It was chaos. Spears, stones, and arrows flew from nowhere. Legionaries, squeezed on the narrow road, couldn't even form a battle order. Maniples mixed into a heap. Officers shouted orders, but no one heard them in this hell. The Romans were attacked from the flank, from the most vulnerable side. Celts, howling wildly, hacked into the defenseless sides of the column, pushing men into the water. Those not hacked down on the spot ran into the lake. Men in heavy chainmail tried to swim, but drowned under the weight of their gear. Others stood neck-deep in water, begging for mercy, while Hannibal's horsemen rode straight into the lake and chopped off their heads like cabbages. The water near the shore became thick and crimson. The streams running down from the hills carried not water, but blood. To this day, one of the streams in that area is called Sanguinetto, the bloody one. Historians claim the battle was so ferocious that the fighters didn't notice a powerful earthquake that occurred at that moment in Tuscany. Cities collapsed, mountains changed shape. But here, in the fog, men were so consumed by murder that they didn't feel the earth shake. Rage drowned out the instinct of self-preservation. Where was Flaminius? He was darting about in the center of this nightmare, trying to gather the remnants of the army. But it was too late. His golden armor, a symbol of power, became a target. A Gallic horseman named Ducarius recognized the consul. "Here is the man who destroyed our legions and ravaged our fields," he shouted to his tribesmen. Ducarius hacked through the bodyguards, struck with a spear, and took the Roman consul's head off. Flaminius's body fell into the mud and was trampled by thousands of feet. Hannibal later looked for him to bury him with honors befitting a general, but he didn't find him. The Roman consul had vanished, becoming part of the bloody mess his army had turned into. 3 hours. It took just 3 hours to destroy 15,000 Romans. Just as many were taken prisoner. Hannibal lost only 1,500 men. When the fog lifted, the sun illuminated a scene that made the blood run cold, even in veterans. The valley was strewn with bodies so densely that the ground could not be seen. The silence that fell after the battle was more terrifying than the screams. It was the silence of a graveyard. But the most terrifying thing was not happening here. The most terrifying thing was happening in Rome. Rumors traveled faster than messengers. First, a whisper, "Flaminius is defeated." Then a scream, "The army is destroyed!" Crowds of people flocked to the forum. Women stood at the city gates, peering into the faces of the few fugitives, trying to recognize their husbands and sons. They grabbed the cloaks of passing senators, demanding the truth. But the senators themselves were in terror. They hid in the curia, afraid to come out to the people. Lying was pointless. Finally, closer to sunset, Praetor Marcus Pomponius stepped onto the speaker's platform. He didn't make long speeches. He didn't look for excuses. He looked at the crowd of thousands, holding its breath, and uttered one phrase that hit Rome harder than any battering ram. "We have lost a great battle." That's it. Nothing more. The crowd exploded in a wail of despair. It was the end of the world. 2 armies destroyed in 6 months. 1 consul wounded, the other killed. The road to Rome is open. Not a single legion remains between Hannibal and the Eternal City. Not a single soldier. Only 3 days' march. People expected the Carthaginian cavalry to appear at the gates any minute. They waited for siege, starvation, slavery. In this atmosphere of total panic, when it seemed the gods had turned away from Rome, the old system of government collapsed. Democracy is good in peacetime. On the edge of the abyss, dictatorship is needed. One will is needed, one hand capable of keeping the city from falling into the void. The Senate, stepping over its pride, makes a decision not resorted to for decades. They appoint a dictator. The man who was supposed to save Rome was named Quintus Fabius Maximus. He wasn't young, he wasn't hot-headed, he was the complete opposite of the deceased Flaminius, a slow, cautious, pedantic old man whom many considered boring. But it was this boring old man who understood what others did not. Hannibal cannot be defeated in open battle. Hannibal is a predator who feeds on the enemy's aggression. Therefore, he must be deprived of food. We must stop playing by his rules. Fabius took power in a city that smelled of fear. He looked at the map, where Lake Trasimene spread like a red stain, and made a decision that would make Rome hate him. He decided not to fight. While Hannibal celebrated his triumph and distributed captured Roman weapons to his soldiers, a completely different war was beginning in Rome. A war of attrition, a war of nerves. The era of the cunctator, the delayer, was arriving, and it promised to be excruciating for everyone. Rome got the dictator it deserved, but whom it hated. Quintus Fabius Maximus didn't become a savior on a white horse. He became a warden. His strategy was as simple as a club blow and as agonizing as slow torture. Do not engage in battle. At all. Under no circumstances. The legions followed Hannibal at a distance of 1 day's march. Staying on the high ground with the Punic cavalry was useless. They were a shadow, a ghost hanging behind his back, but never attacking. Imagine yourself in the place of a Roman legionary. You are walking through the hills of your native Italy. Below, in the valley, you see smoke. Those are burning villas.
Those are blazing olive groves that your fathers grew for decades. You hear the weeping of women being driven into slavery. You grip the hilt of your sword until your knuckles turn white. You want to go down and kill these barbarians, but the dictator's order is ironclad. Hold! Fabius watched the fires with the icy calm of a surgeon amputating a limb to save the body. He understood. Time is working for Rome. Hannibal is in a foreign land, without supply bases, without reinforcements. Every day of idleness kills his army more surely than a sword. Hannibal, that genius of psychology, instantly understood the game. He needed a battle like air. Without victories, his army of mercenaries would begin to decompose. And he started provoking Fabius. He didn't just plunder, he humiliated. The Punics deliberately burned everything around, but left Fabius's own estates untouched. Hannibal was essentially saying to the Roman people, "See, your dictator is in league with me. I don't touch his goods while yours burn." It was poison that penetrated the very heart of Rome. The city choked with rage. In the forum, they shouted that Fabius was a coward. They nicknamed him Cunctator, the delayer. Back then, it sounded like a dirty slur, like a brand of shame. "We chose a man and got a nanny," demagogues yelled. The master of the horse, Marcus Minucius, openly sabotaged the dictator's orders, calling him a pedagogue leading Hannibal by the hand through Italy. Democracy has a fatal flaw. The mob demands simple solutions to complex problems. The mob doesn't want a strategy for years. It wants victory by lunchtime. Fabius's 6 months of dictatorship expired. He saved Rome by not letting Hannibal destroy the remnants of the army. But Rome didn't say thank you. Rome spit in his face. The people demanded blood. The people demanded revenge. The year 216 BC arrived. The election of consuls turned into hysteria. The aristocracy put forward Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an experienced, cautious military man who shared Fabius's views. But the people chose their hero. He was Gaius Terentius Varro, a butcher's son, a populist, a loudmouth, a man who said what the masses wanted to hear. Look at this man. Varro is the embodiment of Roman pride. He promised to end the war with one blow. "I won't hide in the mountains like those cowardly patricians," he bellowed at meetings. "I will lead the legions into the field and crush the enemy." And Rome believed him. Rome gave him everything he asked for. Never before had the Republic assembled such might. Usually, a consular army consisted of 2 legions. This time, they gathered 8. Together with allies, nearly 90,000 men. 90,000. It was a living sea of steel and flesh. When this army marched, the ground shook so much that water in wells turned muddy. The dust raised by thousands of feet blocked out the sun. It seemed that this mass alone was capable of crushing Hannibal simply by stepping over him. Wise Fabius, looking at these preparations, told Aemilius Paulus words that sound like an epitaph. "Remember, you will have to fight not only Hannibal, but also Varro. Hannibal wants a battle, and Varro wants a battle. You alone want the salvation of the state." But who listens to old bores when the air smells of imminent victory? The army moved south, to Apulia, to where Hannibal had captured the fortress of Cannae, where grain reserves were stored. Hannibal was waiting for them. He knew they would come. He chose the place. He chose the time. The plain near the Aufidus River, flat as a table, sun-scorched earth. The ideal place for cavalry, of which he had more. But the Romans didn't care. There were twice as many of them. What difference does it make where you kill the enemy, if there are twice as many of you? The atmosphere in the Roman camp was electrified. The consuls commanded in turns, one day Paulus, one day Varro.
It was command schizophrenia. On Paulus's days, the army stood still, strengthening the camp. On Varro's days, it was eager for battle, provoking skirmishes. Hannibal saw this discord. He felt Varro's impatience, like a shark senses blood in the water. August 2nd, 216 BC, the day Varro was in command. The sun rose over Apulia blood red. A hot wind, which the locals call sirocco, blew straight into the faces of the Romans, carrying clouds of sand and dust. Varro raised the red flag above his tent, the signal for battle. Finally, exhaled the legionaries. They were tired of waiting. They were tired of being afraid. They wanted this nightmare to end today. They didn't know their wish would be granted. For 50,000 of them, this day would indeed be their last. Varro led the army out of the camp, arranging it in a gigantic, deep rectangle. He decided to bet on brute force, to crush, break through, trample the thin Carthaginian line with mass. It was the tactic of a fist. Hannibal was preparing the tactic of an embrace. A deadly embrace. While the legions were forming up, creating a wall of shields kilometers long, Hannibal stood on a hill and smiled. Beside him stood his cavalry commander, Gisgo. Seeing the Romans see, Gisgo whispered in horror, "There are surprisingly many of them." Hannibal turned to him and, with a boyish grin, replied, "You forgot to notice one more most surprising thing, Gisgo. Among all this huge crowd, there isn't a single one named Gisgo." The entourage burst out laughing. This laughter, cynical and daring, swept through the ranks of the Punic army. They knew they were going into battle against a Leviathan, but they knew they were led by the devil. The mechanism of the greatest catastrophe of antiquity was cocked. The Roman machine, heavy, clumsy, blinded by its own power, clanking its treads, rolled toward its doom. And in the center of the field, as if inviting a dance, stood Hannibal's thin formation, curved like a crescent moon. The trap was open. The victim stepped inside. A windy afternoon in Apulia. The wind, which the locals call vulturnus, blew at the backs of the Carthaginians and straight into the faces of the Romans, carrying clouds of dust and sand. 80,000 legionnaires marched forward, heads down, squinting against the dirt flying into their eyes. They didn't see what was happening on the flanks. They saw only the enemy's center, half-naked Celts and Iberians in linen tunics, arranged in a strange arc bulging toward the Romans. It seemed like weakness. It seemed the barbarians were already ready to run, and their line was bulging from fear. The Roman battle cry, "Bara!" shook the air, and the giant machine of the Republic crashed into the living wall. The impact was of such force that the first rows of Carthaginians simply vanished, smeared by shields. The Celts fought with the fury of the doomed, but the Roman mass pressed on. The depth of the Roman formation was monstrous. Maniples stood so tightly that the rear ranks literally pushed the front ones onto enemy swords. Hannibal's center began to bend, first slowly, then faster. The arc bulging toward the Romans became a straight line, and then began to concave inward, turning into a bag. Legionaries, feeling the enemy give way, roared with delight. "Victory! They're running!" The crowd rushed into the forming funnel, being sucked in deeper and deeper. They thought they were breaking the front. In reality, they were entering the beast's throat. Hannibal stood in the center of this hell, risking his life alongside the rank and file. He personally controlled the center's retreat. It was the most difficult maneuver in the history of warfare. To retreat, but not to run. To hold the line on the verge of breaking. And when the Roman mass was drawn deep into the crescent, the trap snapped shut. On the flanks stood fresh units of African infantry, clad in captured Roman armor. At a trumpet signal, they didn't run back. They turned and struck the flanks of the Roman column. At the same time, Hannibal's heavy cavalry, having already chased off the Roman horsemen, returned and struck from the rear. The bag was tied. 80,000 men were trapped in a ring. What happened next, military historians dryly call encirclement. But those who were there would have called it a meat grinder. Cannae ceased to be a battle. It became an execution. The Romans were compressed so tightly they couldn't raise their arms to strike a blow. They lacked air. Men died standing up, crushed by the bodies of comrades, and even the dead had nowhere to fall. They continued to stand in formation, swaying to the beat of the monstrous rhythm of the slaughter. The outer circle of Carthaginians worked like a machine. Spear thrust, step forward, thrust, step. It wasn't the rage of berserkers, it was the heavy, monotonous work of butchers. The Romans in the center, not yet understanding what was happening, simply waited their turn to die. Imagine the horror. You stand in a crowd, hear screams, smell blood and excrement, but see no enemy. You only feel the ring tightening, the pressure on your chest becoming unbearable. Minute after minute, hour after hour. The sun beat down mercilessly, thirst tormented worse than wounds, and death crept up slowly and inexorably. In this crush, ranks and titles vanished. Senators in snow-white togas died trampled into the dust by the boots of new recruits. Servius Geminus, the consul of the previous year, died with sword in hand. Minucius, the very one who argued with Fabius, met his end here. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, wounded by a stone to the face at the very beginning of the fight, sat on a rock, bleeding out. When an officer raced by offering him a horse, Paulus refused. "Tell Fabius," he wheezed, spitting red foam, "that I lived and die following his precepts. Now go, while you can." The consul remained to wait for the final blow, while his colleague, the loudmouth Varro, saving his own skin, was already speeding away from the battlefield with a pathetic handful of horsemen. Cannae is the triumph of quality over quantity. Hannibal showed the world that an army is not a sum of soldiers, but a single organism. By sunset, it was all over. Lying on the field, by various estimates, were between 50 and 70,000 Romans. 70,000. To understand the scale, that is the population of a large, ancient city, slaughtered in a single daylight day. Blood soaked the ground so deeply that the wind raised not dust, but a red mist into the air. When the moon illuminated this field, it saw a scene from the underworld. Marauders wandered among mountains of corpses, finishing off the wounded. They weren't looking for weapons or armor. There was too much iron. It had lost its value. They were looking for gold. Rings. Gold signet rings that only equestrians and senators had the right to wear. This was the sign of supreme power, the elite of Rome. Carthaginians ripped them from stiffened fingers, hacking off hands if the rings wouldn't come off. This wasn't just robbery. It was a symbol. Hannibal didn't just destroy legions. He beheaded the Republic. He wiped out an entire class of administrators. A third of the Senate remained lying in the mud of Apulia. Hundreds of the noblest lines ended that day. Roman society was gutted. Hannibal walked across the field, stepping over bodies. He looked into the faces of dead enemies, but there was no joy in his eyes. Only the cold fatigue of a master who has finished a great and terrible creation. His officers, drunk on blood and victory, shouted, "To Rome! In 5 days you will be dining on the Capitol!"
The cavalry commander Maharbal threw in his face, "You know how to win, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use victory." But Hannibal was silent. He knew what they did not. He had no siege engines. His army was exhausted. And most importantly, he expected that Rome, like any normal state, now that its spine was broken, would crawl to beg for peace. The rings were poured into grain measures. There were so many that they lost exact count. More than 3 modii. That's tens of kilograms of gold. Hannibal ordered this terrible cargo sent to Carthage. Not the heads of enemies, not their banners, but their power, cast in gold. He thought this argument would force the Council of Elders to finally send him reinforcements for the final blow. Sacks of rings, clinking with every step of the mules, set off on the long journey south to be poured onto the marble floor of the council as final proof that Rome was no longer the master of the world. A ringing sound, a deafening, metallic ringing that made the ears of the council members in Carthage pop. It was Hannibal's brother, Mago, pouring the contents of the sacks brought from Italy onto the marble floor. Hundreds, thousands of gold rings rolled to the feet of the richest men in Africa. They sparkled in the torchlight like the eyes of the dead. "You didn't believe?" shouted Mago, his voice breaking with excitement. "Here is the proof. All of Rome's nobility lies in the earth. The legions are no more. Give us grain, give us money, give us men, and by winter, Rome will fall." The hall was silent. It was a silence not of awe, but of envy. Merchants and oligarchs looked at the gold taken from corpses and saw not the victory of their homeland, but a threat to their wallets. Hannibal was becoming too strong. Hanno the Great, an old enemy of the Barcids, stood up. He looked at the mountain of gold, then at Mago, and asked a question that killed Carthage more surely than Roman legions. If Hannibal destroyed all the enemies, why does he need soldiers? And if he didn't destroy them, then what is he bragging about? Instead of an army of reinforcements, the council sent Hannibal a polite refusal. Genius won the battle, but envy lost the war. The moment the rings touched the floor, Hannibal was doomed. Meanwhile, in Rome, something defying logic was happening. Any other city, having lost a fifth of its male population in 2 years, would have opened its gates. But Rome is not a city. It is a sect. It is a collective mind welded by iron discipline and belief in its own exceptionalism. The first thing the Senate did upon learning of the catastrophe was to ban crying. Do you hear? Ban mourning. Women were ordered not to appear on the streets so their wails wouldn't undermine morale. Mourning was limited to 30 days. "We have no time for tears," the city fathers declared. The word peace was equated to high treason. Anyone who stuttered about negotiations was declared an enemy. But behind this facade of iron will hid a primal, sticky terror. The Romans, who considered themselves the most civilized people of the Oecumene, fell into mystical madness. They decided the gods had turned away from them, and gods must be appeased with blood. In the Forum Boarium, a stone chamber was dug. Into it, they lowered 4 people alive, a Greek couple and a Gallic couple, a living man and woman bound in chains. Priests recited prayers while workers sealed the entrance with stones and covered it with earth. Imagine that dull thud of earth on the lid of the crypt. Rome offered human sacrifices to buy itself the right to live. It was the agony of morality. They were ready to become monsters just to avoid becoming slaves. Hannibal was camped just a few days' march away. He waited for ambassadors. He was sure Rome would crawl to him on its knees. He even allowed captured Romans to send a delegation to the Senate to negotiate a ransom. The price was laughable: 3 minae of silver for a horseman. The Carthaginian behaved like a gentleman observing the rules of war. He didn't understand that the rules had changed. The Senate received the delegation of prisoners. Relatives crowded at the doors of the Curia, clutching money in their hands, ready to buy back their sons and husbands. But the doors opened, and Consul Titus Manlius Torquatus came out. His answer thundered like a sentence: "Rome does not need you. He who surrendered is unworthy of being a citizen." Rome refused to pay. 7,000 of its own soldiers were abandoned to their fate, sold into slavery in Africa, crossed off the lists of the living. It was a cruel lesson for the rest. You have only 2 exits: victory or death. There is no third option. Captivity does not exist. Hannibal, learning of the refusal, was shocked. He realized he was fighting not an army, but madmen who would sooner burn down their own house with themselves inside than hand over the keys. His paradox was that he had smashed the Roman body, but failed to break the Roman spirit. Maharbal was right. Hannibal did not go to Rome. He had no siege engines, no rear support. His men were tired. But perhaps he simply couldn't believe that an adversary lying in a pool of his own blood was still trying to bite him in the throat. While old Rome buried people alive and renounced its children, in the town of Canusium, where the pitiful remnants of fugitives from Cannae had gathered, a new Rome was being born. A group of young patricians sat in a tent. They were broken. The leader of the defeatists, Caecilius Metellus, was saying, "It's all over. Italy is no more. Let's hire ships and sail to the kings of the East, enter their service." They nodded, ready to betray everything for life. And then a youth burst into the tent with a bloody sword in his hand. His eyes burned with a cold, frantic fire. It was Publius Cornelius Scipio, the very one who saved his father at the Ticinus. He walked up to Metellus and put the blade to his throat. "I swear," he snarled, "I will not abandon the Republic myself, and will not allow anyone else to do so. Swear, Metellus, and all of you, swear that you will not leave Rome, or this sword will drink your blood right now." And they swore. Under fear of death, looking into the mad eyes of a 19-year-old boy, they pledged allegiance to a corpse, which the Republic seemed to be. In that stifling tent, amidst the smell of sweat and fear, the era of old, slow strategies ended. Scipio didn't just want to win. He wanted to destroy Carthage. He absorbed Hannibal's every step, every maneuver. He was the great Punic's best student. While Hannibal waited for an answer from the Senate, in Canusium, his future death had already sheathed its sword, sparing the traitors so they could serve as instruments of revenge. Rome survived, not because it was stronger, but because it turned out to be more stubborn than death. They raised new legions. They freed 8,000 slaves, buying them from masters at state expense, and gave them weapons. They released criminals from prisons. Teenage boys put on their father's armor. It was an army of outcasts, an army of ghosts, but it was ready to fight. Hannibal remained alone in Italy, undefeated, but locked in a cage of his own victory, while time, the most ruthless killer, began its countdown. While Rome licked its wounds, and Hannibal aimlessly maneuvered through southern Italy, waiting for an answer that would not come, on the other side of the sea, a new star rose. Publius Cornelius Scipio, the very youth who swore over the bloody sword, arrived in Spain. He was only 25 years old. By Roman laws, he was too young to command even a century, let alone an army.
But when the Senate asked who wanted to go to Spain, where Scipio's father and uncle had already died, silence hung in the hall. All the old generals looked away. They feared the name Barca like a curse. Only he stood up. Scipio was not like the Roman generals of the old school. He didn't believe in frontal attacks and brute force. He was Hannibal 2.0, an improved Roman version of the Carthaginian genius. He studied his enemy not with hatred, but with the admiration of a surgeon studying anatomy. He understood the main thing. Hannibal's strength is not in elephants or Numidians, but in speed and unpredictability. And Scipio decided to be faster. The year 209 BC, New Carthage, the capital of the Barcid Empire in Spain, a fortress city standing on a peninsula surrounded by the sea and a lagoon. Taking it by storm was considered impossible, but Scipio learned a secret from local fishermen that was worth more than 1,000 legions. During low tide and strong wind, the water in the lagoon recedes, exposing the bottom near the northern wall, where fortifications were weakest. He told his soldiers that Neptune had appeared to him in a dream and promised help. It was pure cynicism and brilliant psychology. Soldiers believe gods more readily than strategists. When the water really did recede, the legionaries took it as a miracle. They walked knee-deep in mud, where the enemy expected deep water, and burst into the city. The massacre was short, but effective. By sunset, the capital fell. Scipio seized the treasury, arsenals, and, most importantly, noble hostages from Iberian tribes. Instead of selling them into slavery, as any other Roman would have done, he sent them home with gifts. It was checkmate. Iberian chiefs, yesterday's allies of Carthage, were swearing allegiance to Rome today. Scipio pulled the rug out from under the Barcids. He deprived them of resources, men, and a base. In Spain remained Hannibal's brother, Hasdrubal. Realizing the peninsula was lost, he makes a desperate decision. If Spain cannot be held, Italy must be saved. Hasdrubal gathers the remnants of the army, the treasury, and elephants to repeat his brother's feat. He goes to the Alps. Rome shuddered. Imagine the horror. One Hannibal brought the Republic to its knees. What will two Hannibals do? If the brothers unite, if the north and south of Italy close into a single front, Rome is finished. The math of war was inexorable. Spring of the year 207 BC. Hasdrubal crossed the Alps faster and easier than his brother. He descended into the Po Valley and sent messengers to Hannibal with a message: "Meet in Umbria." But fate is a cruel joker. Hannibal did not wait for these messengers. They were intercepted by Roman patrols. The letters, containing the detailed plan for the junction of the two armies, lay on the desk of Consul Gaius Claudius Nero. Nero was a man of action. He was camped in the south, holding Hannibal back. The law forbade a consul to leave his theater of war without the Senate's order. Violation was punishable by death. But Nero understood. While the Senate deliberates, Rome will perish. He commits an insane forced march. At night, secretly, he takes 7,000 elite fighters and goes north, leaving effigies and burning fires in the camp, so Hannibal would think the entire Roman army was in place. For 7 days they marched, as if furies were chasing them. They barely slept, ate on the move. In the north, the second consul, Marcus Livius Salinator, was waiting for them. When Nero arrived, he ordered his soldiers not to pitch tents, but to bunk with their comrades, so the enemy wouldn't notice the increase in numbers. Hasdrubal was not supposed to know that there were now 2 consular armies against him. The Battle of the Metaurus began in the morning. Hasdrubal, an old fox, sensed something was wrong. He heard a double trumpet signal in the Roman camp, a sign that 2 consuls were there. He saw the old, worn shields of Nero's soldiers covered in southern dust.
He realized he had been outwitted and tried to retreat, but his guides betrayed him, leaving the army wandering along the banks of the Metaurus River. Pinned to the river, the Carthaginians were forced to accept battle. It was a brutal, chaotic scrum. Elephants, crazed by the noise, trampled their own and strangers alike. Hasdrubal fought like a lion.
He realized this was the end. Seeing his army running or dying, he did not want to survive this disgrace. Removing his helmet and commander's cloak, he spurred his horse and crashed into the thickest part of the Roman infantry. He died as he lived, sword in hand, a worthy son of Hamilcar. In the south of Italy, Hannibal was still waiting. He stared at the northern horizon, hoping to see the dust of his brother's columns. He didn't know the battle was already lost. He didn't know his hope was dead. A few days later, Roman horsemen galloped up to the outposts of the Carthaginian camp. They didn't attack. They simply threw something heavy over the rampart and rode away. The object fell into the dust with a dull thud and rolled to the feet of the sentries. It wasn't an amphora of wine, and not a scroll with an ultimatum. Hannibal was called immediately. He walked up to the object, around which flies were already buzzing. It was a head. The skin had turned gray. The eyes had glazed over and stared into the void with silent reproach. The mouth twisted in a final grimace of pain. But Hannibal recognized the features. He recognized the scar on the cheek. He recognized his brother. Hasdrubal had arrived for the meeting. Historians write that Hannibal looked at the severed head for a long time without saying a word. No tears, no screams, only the cold realization of the abyss. For the first time in 15 years of war, the great general understood that he had lost. Not a battle, no. He had lost destiny. The Romans didn't just kill his brother. They violated all laws, divine and human, by throwing a general's head like trash instead of committing it to the fire. It was a message. We are no longer afraid of you. We are coming for you. Hannibal raised his eyes to his officers, who recoiled in horror from the terrible gift, and quietly uttered a phrase that became the epitaph of a great dream. I recognize the doom of Carthage. In that moment, the great hunter turned into prey. He began a slow, agonizing retreat to the very toe of the Italian boot, into Brutium. He snapped back like a wounded beast. He was still invincible in battle, but the ring was tightening. Scipio, having finished with Spain, returned to Rome as a triumphant victor. And now the young wolf looked across the sea at Africa. He wasn't going to catch Hannibal in the mountains of Italy. He was going to set fire to his house. The war, started for one man's revenge, was returning to where it was born, to Carthage. Imagine smoke. Thick, black, greasy smoke rising over the fertile valley of the Bagradus River in North Africa. These are the burning estates of those very Carthaginian oligarchs who for years refused Hannibal help. The very ones who considered trade profits more important than state security. Now war had come to their home, and it wasn't brought by a barbarian or a madman, but by a cold, calculating Roman aristocrat, Publius Cornelius Scipio. The year 204 BC flipped the chessboard. Scipio made a brilliant move. Instead of catching Hannibal in the mountains of Italy, he attacked the defenseless underbelly of Carthage. He landed in Africa and began methodically burning everything in his path. Carthaginians, used to fighting with other people's hands on foreign soil, fell into hysteria. The Great Council, the same one that laughed at the sacks of rings, now trembled with terror. They had no generals. They had no army capable of stopping the Roman machine. They had only one trump card left: the man they feared more than the enemy. Messengers raced across the sea to Italy. To the very toe of the boot, to Brutium, where Hannibal Barca paced like a wounded lion in a cage. Try to feel the bitterness of this moment. 15 years. For 15 long years, this man held Rome by the throat. He led his army through the icy hell of the Alps. He drowned legions in blood at Trebia and Trasimene. He gave them Cannae. He lived in tents, slept on the ground, ate soldiers' rations, and lost friends and brothers. He did all this for a homeland that didn't lift a finger to help him finish off the enemy. And now, when their villas are burning, they scream, "Save us!" Historians write that upon hearing the order to return, Hannibal gnashed his teeth. He didn't cry, he howled with rage. He pounded his fist on the table, cursing not Rome, not Scipio, and not the gods. He cursed his own fellow citizens. "It was not the Roman people who defeated Hannibal," he shouted, looking into the faces of the terrified ambassadors, "but the Carthaginian Senate, with its envy and greed. Hanno the Great got what he wanted. He destroyed our home, just to bury my glory under its rubble." The evacuation began. It was like being buried alive. Hannibal ordered his veterans, the few who had gone through the whole war with him, to be loaded onto ships. These were no longer just soldiers. These were Hannibal's men. Italians, Brutians, Lucanians who betrayed Rome for him and now knew. If they stayed, the cross awaited them. Those who refused to sail were slaughtered on the spot. Hannibal could not leave the Romans a single soldier, a single horse. In the temple of Juno Licinia, he left a bronze tablet listing his victories, a monument to a war he won tactically but lost politically. When the last ship pushed off from the shore of Croton, Hannibal stood on the stern and looked back. The coast of Italy melted into the fog, the land he knew better than the streets of his native city, the land where he left his youth and his eye. He was leaving undefeated. Not a single Roman general had ever managed to defeat him in open battle on Italian soil. But he was leaving defeated. He knew Rome had endured. Rome outlasted him. Rome won not with a sword, but with stubbornness. The voyage was gloomy. The sea seemed to sense the general's mood. Hannibal was 45 years old. He left Carthage as a 9-year-old boy, full of hope and hatred. He was returning, a graying, one-eyed old man, tired of killing. He was bringing home not triumph, but a last chance for survival. Autumn, 203 BC. Hannibal's army landed at Leptis Minor, south of Carthage. He stepped onto the African sand, and that sand burned his feet. His homeland met him not with flowers, but with the smell of fear. Carthage was in chaos. Refugees flooded the streets. Bread prices skyrocketed. Endless sacrifices were made in temples. People looked at Hannibal like a messiah, like a god of war descended from heaven. "He has returned! He will save us!" They didn't want to see that their god was mortally tired. And Scipio was waiting. The young Roman wolf, who was only in his early 30s, acted like the master in Africa. He knew Hannibal had returned. More than that, he craved this meeting. For Scipio, the war was personal. He grew up on stories about Hannibal. He learned to fight by dissecting Hannibal's battles. Beating someone else made no sense to him. He needed the king's head. To become the greatest, you must kill the greatest. Two gigantic forces were converging. But look at their composition. It was a cruel irony of fate. Scipio commanded superbly trained, hardened Roman legions and, attention,
Numidian cavalry. Yes, the very legendary cavalry that brought Hannibal victory at Cannae. King Massinissa betrayed Carthage and switched to Rome's side, taking the best horsemen in the world with him. And what did Hannibal have? A motley crowd. Tired veterans from Italy, hastily recruited local militia who didn't know how to hold a formation, and 80 war elephants. But these weren't the experienced beasts that crossed the Alps. These were young, unmanageable animals caught in the savannah in a hurry. They were as dangerous to their own side as to the enemy. Hannibal realized the balance of power was catastrophic. He tried to do something he had never done before. He tried to negotiate. He asked Scipio for a personal meeting. Picture the scene. The plain of Zama. No man's land between two camps. Two horsemen ride to meet in the center. Silence so deep you can hear the horses breathing. On one side, Hannibal Barca, legend, the terror of Rome, a man epic. On the other, Publius Cornelius Scipio, the rising sun, the future of the empire.
They look each other in the eye. Interpreters are silent. Both speak excellent Greek.
I would be happy if the gods had given our fathers a different mind, Hannibal says quietly. You are young, Scipio. You are lucky, as I was lucky once. But fortune is deceptive. Look at me. I stood at the gates of your city, and now I am here, bargaining for the life of mine. Do not tempt fate. Take the peace I offer. Carthage will give up all islands, all possessions. We will lock ourselves in Africa. Leave us only freedom. It was the speech of a sage who has known the futility of ambition. But Scipio was not a sage. He was a conqueror at the peak of glory. He looked at the old lion without pity. Rome does not bargain over victory, Hannibal, he replied coldly. You came to us with a sword, and by the sword your fate will be decided. Prepare for battle. They rode apart. Peace was rejected. Diplomacy died. Only the field remained, covered in dust, where tomorrow the fate of the entire Mediterranean would be decided. Who will rule the world for the next 500 years? Merchants or soldiers? Whose law will become the law for nations? The answer to this question had to be given by the bloody sand of Zama, where the student prepared to surpass the teacher using his own lessons. October 19th, 202 BC. The sun rises over the plain of Zama, illuminating the finale of the greatest drama of antiquity. The air trembles with tension. On one side, Scipio's legions arranged in a checkerboard pattern. On the other, Carthage's last hope, 80 war elephants, a living avalanche ready to grind the Romans into powder. Hannibal bets on the first strike. If the elephants crush the Roman formation, the infantry will finish off the survivors. It is crude, it is primitive, but he has no choice. Trumpets roar, and the ground begins to shake. 80 gray giants, driven by the shouts of mahouts, rush forward. Imagine standing in the front row of the hastati. A wall weighing hundreds of tons is rushing at you. Instinct screams, "Run!" But Roman discipline is not just training. It is the suppression of instincts. Scipio did not flinch. He knew this would happen, and he had prepared a surprise. Instead of a solid wall of shields against which attacks usually smashed, the Roman formation suddenly parted. Maniples shifted, forming wide corridors all the way through. It was like floodgates opening on a dam. Elephants are smart animals. They don't want to crash into an obstacle if they see a clear path. And they ran where they were invited, into the void. The living tanks rushed through the Roman formation without touching anyone, like water through a grate. And there, in the corridors, velites were already waiting for them. Javelins flew into soft flanks, eyes, trunks. Trumpeters blew huge horns right into the animals' ears. Crazed with pain and noise, the elephants turned around and trampled their own troops. Hannibal's formidable weapon turned into the instrument of his suicide. The Carthaginian left flank was crushed by their own beasts. But the battle was just beginning. The elephants were gone, and the men clashed. It was a terrible, silent massacre. In the center stood Hannibal's veterans, those who had walked Italy with him. They knew there was no way back. They fought not for Carthage, they fought for their god of war. The Romans pressed, but the Carthaginian old guard stood to the death. Scipio saw his legions bogging down in this bloody mud. It seemed the scales of fate froze. Hannibal, the genius of tactics, could still turn the tide of the battle. And then the horizon darkened with dust. Hannibal raised his single eye to the sky and realized, this is the end. From the rear, with the thunder of thousands of hooves, the Roman cavalry was returning. But it wasn't led by a Roman. It was led by Massinissa, the Numidian king who betrayed Carthage. The very horsemen who gave Hannibal victory at Cannae were now bringing him death. The circle closed. History made a full, mocking revolution. The blow to the rear was crushing. Hannibal's army was in the bag. Exactly like the Romans at Cannae 14 years ago. Scipio didn't invent anything new. He simply took the teacher's lesson and used it against him. Hannibal watched as his veterans, his lions, perished under sword blows, squeezed in a vice. He was surrounded by his own move. This wasn't just Rome's victory, it was a personal message from Scipio. I learned everything you taught. 20,000 Carthaginians remained lying on the field of Zama. Carthage as a great power ceased to exist that afternoon. Hannibal, seeing all was lost, turned his horse. He didn't seek a heroic death in battle. He was too pragmatic for cheap theatrics. He fled to Hadrumetum to return to the capital and tell his fellow citizens the truth they were afraid to hear. When he entered the Council of Elders, they looked at him like a ghost. He didn't make excuses. He tore off his armor, threw it on the floor, and said, "I lost not a battle. I lost the war. Surrender." The man who hated Rome with every cell of his body was now forcing his people to sign a capitulation. It was his last, bitterest service to his homeland. He understood. Slavery is better than total annihilation. The peace terms were humiliating. Carthage lost its fleet, colonies, the right to wage war without Rome's permission, and had to pay a monstrous indemnity for 50 years. The great city turned into a harmless trading post on the backyard of the Roman world. And what of Hannibal? He would live almost 20 more years. 20 years of wandering, chases, and loneliness. Rome did not forgive him. Romans chased him all over the East, like a nightmare that wouldn't go away. Senators shuddered at the mention of his name, even when he became a feeble old man. In the end, cornered in a small fortress in Bithynia, betrayed by everyone, he would take poison from the ring he had carried with him all his life. His last words would be a spit in the face of eternity. "Let us free Rome from her anxiety, since they cannot wait for the death of one old man." But let's stop and look at the ashes of history. The war ended. Rome won. But look at the winner. The republic that entered this war died at Cannae. The one that came out of the war became something else. It learned to burn cities, kill prisoners, and dictate its will to the world. In fighting a monster, Rome grew fangs itself. Hannibal dreamed of destroying Rome, but instead, he unwittingly became the architect of the Roman Empire. He forced them to create a professional army.
He taught them to think globally. He forged from a loose federation an iron fist that would hold the world by the throat for the next 500 years. And now I will ask you a question that will give you no peace. Look closely at the face of Hannibal taking poison, and at the face of Scipio, who will die in oblivion, exiled by ungrateful Rome. Which of them actually won? Hannibal, who remained true to his oath until his last breath and became a symbol of defiance? Or Rome, which survived but sold its soul to the god of war, turning into that very soulless machine we know? Maybe the real tragedy isn't that Carthage fell, but that to defeat the dragon, the knight had to become a dragon himself. And when you look at the ruins of Carthage, remember, they are silent not because they have nothing to say. They are silent because their story is a mirror into which we are afraid to look.